Hi, and welcome to Gamers exPlane, a channel dedicated to tabletop role-playing games, particularly play-by-post using gamersplane.com. In the segment Player versus Player, I interview users from Gamersplane in order to find out how people use the service and engage in play-by-post gaming. Hopefully we will learn from each other and improve our own games, and maybe have a little fun along the way. In today's episode, I interview a user named Khakiphil, and we discuss whatever we want, but mostly we're discussing game balance and player agency and how to measure and use those tools, and sometimes when you might want to break them. I'm Qralloq, and this is Gamers exPlane. Hi, and welcome to Gamers exPlane. I'm Qralloq, and I have with me Khakiphil. Hi.
Hi there.
So we were introduced by Gamersplane user Lav Todd, who I understand is a real life friend of yours. And
yep, that's correct.
Yeah. So how did you get into tabletop role playing?
I started way back. I was still in college at the time, so it must have been 2009, 2010. There were a group of my friends that all wanted to get into tabletop gaming, or D&D 4th edition at the time. And they were like, okay, we don't know anyone who DMs. Let's roll dice and see who gets the low roll. And I was the one that got to DM. But it was a fun experience. There were a couple of my other friends, like Lav Todd, who had prior DMing experience. So I had some good references to lean on and kind of figure out how to get everything going.
Yeah. Now you guys play in a Roll20 campaign as well, is that right? In this last little while?
A little bit, especially over quarantine. There have been a couple of different games that I've been involved with on and off. Some of them that, like I said, Lav Todd is running. There's another one that I'm running as well. Just a whole bunch of different projects on multiple platforms. And now that quarantine is starting to lift a little bit, I'm even starting to get back into real life in-person gaming.
Yeah. Yeah. So do you think with live gaming back on the table, so to speak, you'll stay with Roll20 campaigns and play by post as well, and just keep your hands on all the pies?
I do think there is a distinct advantage to running a game online, especially with some of my friends starting to get older and getting busy with their day-to-day lives, looking more into their careers. It was a bit of a difficult transition at first, trying to get the flow and the pacing right. But now that we've started to get some good practice into it, I think there's a good advantage to being able to post whenever you want, rather than having to carve out 3 or 4 hours on a weekend or weekday night if you can try and get everyone together at the same point.
Yeah. Yeah, when I was younger in the 90s, I'd game like 4 nights a week and just dedicate the time and 5-6 hours every night. And but now that's just no.
There's only so many nights I can stay up until 3 a.m. these days.
Yeah. Plus you got other responsibilities. And
Exactly. My wife doesn't like it when I walk into the bedroom at 4 a.m, that's for sure.
Smelling like Cheetos and Mountain Dew.
Not her favorite.
Yeah. So how did you get into play-by-post role-playing? Was Gamersplane your first kick at that cat? And
yep, Gamersplane was about the first one. There was a second one that I'd started on Roll20 about the same time, but the Roll20 one faded relatively quickly. I've stuck around Gamersplane a lot longer. It was a couple of months into quarantine that we'd actually started. There was a friend of mine who had started a game of Masks, which is an apocalypse world engine. He had started that up and was curious, hey, do you guys want to try it out? I know we're looking to do some gaming over quarantine. We gave it a shot. He realized that he wasn't really equipped to DM it online, but I jumped in and said, hey, I'll give it a try. And ever since, we're 6, maybe 7 months in at this point, and things are going quite well. We're, I think, over 500 posts in. It's going great.
Wow. Yeah, Masks is an interesting game because a lot of the game setup just occurs by the players, right? In their initial initial kind of backgrounding exercise at the beginning, rather than the GM saying, "Here's my fully functional world. Where do you fit into it?" Yeah.
Yep. In particular for the system, it relies on the players sort of doing a little bit of interfacing between each other to figure out what sort of relationships the team has coming into the game. I guess I should explain for anyone who hasn't played, the game itself is centered on a bunch of young superheroes, kind of like Young Justice or Teen Titans or something like that. So once you've designed your character, then the object is to talk with the other players in the game and establish sort of relationships that you have coming into the game, whether you were classmates before or whether you've done some hero work together. It's a lot more interactive than sort of a standard D&D type scenario where you would want to come up with all the different races in the world, all the different cities, and then sort of plug your player characters into the world. It almost works a little bit in reverse.
Yeah. Yeah, and so the focus on the game is on the drama between the players and NPCs, rather than on overcoming monsters and other serious obstacles.
Yeah, exactly. I think I've heard someone before reference D&D as a bit of a battlefield simulator.
Yeah.
And I think there's some credence to that, but by comparison, Masks is very much more story-driven, character-driven. The action is kind of assumed to happen, especially considering it's a superhero setting.
Yeah.
Where there's never going to be a question of whether or not you have the materials to cast a spell. That's just what you do. So going in, it's less about being able to perform your skills or use your gear or whatever it is you do. It's more about the consequences of your actions and how it affects the rest of your teammates, how it affects the world around you, stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been playing a little bit of Apocalypse World Engine type games. Cult, the Divinity Lost is probably my favorite, but I'm more of a horror buff than.
Oh yeah.
I've played Masks once. And we didn't get very far into it before the game collapsed. Just sometimes they do, but
as they do.
Yeah. Yeah. Now your interest when we first looked at talking to each other was about the idea of game balance, and then there's a fair bit to unpack in the notion of game balance. So do we want to jump right into that?
Yeah, let's go for it.
Okay, so maybe we should start by being clear what we mean by game balance. So how would you define that state?
From sort of a 1,000-yard view, I think when we're talking about balance, we're talking about whether or not everyone at the table thinks that the game is in a fair state, where nothing is pre-scripted to happen, no one is doomed to fail, no one is set up for perfect success. There's a wide array of outcomes that can happen, which is sort of why we play tabletop games in the first place, is to interact with these new and novel situations that we can set our characters into and see what happens. Not knowing what's going to happen is part of the fun of it. So if we want something that's going to be truly interesting and truly of our own design, then we want it to have access to a wide array of possible outcomes. So as long as those outcomes are available to us, then I think we're in something of a balanced state.
Okay. So you're thinking of the game balance as being really the whole kind of the game itself, including the GM's actions and the player's actions, and all kind of as one big whole.
Mm-hmm. Because for every action, there's going to be a reaction, whether it's from the player's aspect or from the GM's aspect. No action is going to go unanswered in an ideal situation.
Yep.
So it's a bit of a dialogue, and we want everyone at the table to have a fair shot at that dialogue, I guess.
Okay. So sometimes when I've heard the term game balance, it's largely been about equity between the players. For example, if you had in D&D terms or in superhero terms, if you have a Superman and a Lois Lane, they have very different abilities to affect the world around them.
Mhm.
And so some games like Smallville really kind of boil that down into story mechanics rather than we can solve this by lifting a battleship mechanics. But D&D doesn't have that. They have, if you're a 20th level fighter and your party has a first level wizard, you're just not going to affect the world the same way.
Mhm. And just to put a term on that ability to affect the plot, the ability to affect a fight, I've heard that term referred to as player agency.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, what conditions do you think we would put on games where that sort of game balance is desirable, and where might we want to break it?
So, as a general rule, at least in terms of player agency, I think we want to encourage something that's relatively balanced, where everyone can chip in and enjoy the game. But I would say there are definitely circumstances where we have to, at some point, break that equity, particularly when it comes to making advances in the plot. If the DM needs to sort of grab the reins for a minute and move things along, um, or if there's a imbalance cropping up in the player-to-player dynamic. If one player is either hogging the spotlight or one player isn't getting enough of the spotlight, then sort of, like I said, grabbing the reins and sort of shifting the dynamic back toward a more equitable state is going to be helpful.
Right. What is the GM, do you think, trying to avoid? Or maybe not just the GM, but the social contract that is a group game. What are we trying to avoid when we end up with an unbalanced play state?
So the problems with you're asking about the problems of an unbalanced play state, yeah?
Yeah. Yeah.
When things get too far out of balance, then you start to get players who feel like their actions don't really mean as much at the table, where they can show up and they can make all the decisions in the world, but at the end of the day, the plot sort of happens to them. It's sort of, as opposed to them affecting the plot. So you get a bit of alienation on the player side when that balance falls too far out of whack.
Yeah. Yeah, I've had game masters where that basically occurs. Is like whatever story he's going to tell, no matter what you do, it's going to occur. You have some say on how it unfolds, but if there's a war coming, you can't stop it, no matter how much diplomacy you have.
Yep, and it's when the games get that far on rails that it feels more like you're watching the DM tell a story from the second person as you get to witness it, but it's sort of happening around you. You're part of a bigger story that's happening, but the story isn't you.
Yeah. I remember this one fight we had is set up this big tower, and we had the villain that we've been trying to get to is at the top of the tower, and it's like, okay, so we're gonna have to out of character, I'm like, so we're gonna have to go into the bottom of the tower, fight our way all the way up, use up all of our resources, and then at the very end fight the boss while we're already wounded and out of healing potions. Like, yep. It's like, yeah, I'm a wizard, so I'm going to use transmute stone to mud and wipe out the bottom of the tower. Just get a 12-foot long, 1 foot deep, thing. The whole tower is going to collapse, killing everybody inside of it. He's like, like, oh no, my villain survives, and now but we'll skip all the other parts. So now you have to fight him one-on-one. I'm like, all right, it's your game.
It's those things that you never anticipate your players doing that just throw everything into chaos. I live for those moments. They're great.
Yeah. Yeah. But he just didn't want that to happen because he thought it would be unsatisfying. So, but it was.
And from his perspective, I can sort of see where it would be unsatisfying because it's sort of taken away his agency from being able to tell a good story. Now, all of a sudden, he has to fit like 3 hours worth of content into a single hour, something. It's all that work has gone to waste. It's painful, but it's a creative solution.
Yeah, yeah. For sure. So we end up killing the boss, and then that was that. Yeah. Um, so another style of when we get to player agency and we're talking about players and monsters, or the GM's adversaries, um, if your players are widely varying in their capabilities in, say, a combat setting, then um, you might have a couple of players who just like don't even care about the combat sessions because they know their actions are ultimately meaningless. That the one guy or the one person that created this entirely combat focused rage machine just is going to dominate and solve all their problems for me when the swords are drawn. And so that kind of game balance is I've seen really drive parties apart, where essentially the game is just going to fold. And so I've joked in prior videos that if you do create that kind of a PC in my game, I'm going to kill you.
It's certainly better for the general health of the party.
Yeah. Do I want to lose 3 players or just you?
Yeah. I do like some of the alternatives that D&D provides in that regard. Like, for instance, if you have one barbarian that's running amok and killing everything, then you can have options to bring in enemies that are resistant to physical damage. Or if you've got a sorcerer that's just wiping the board every time, you can get something that's immune to magic. But I know not every system has those sort of options. If push comes to shove, like, something's got to give, and the health of the table has to come first.
Yeah. Well, that comes up to, if you've got this rage monkey, so he's created this barbarian with, improbable strength and, weapons that deal way too much damage and all of the feats that really just kind of min-max that. Then fights become very short and one-sided. But if you take all that away, you've just completely stripped his character of everything that he's capable of performing. And right, so there's just no good solution, right? Like you can fight intangible monsters that are immune to physical damage, but then, well, so he just sits down and waits out the fight too, which is also
Yeah.
so
short of like stripping his character of equipment, or setting him up with sort of a physical ailment or some kind of status debuff.
Yeah.
There are options, but none of them are particularly good, I don't think.
Yeah, like I guess every encounter could have an intangible foe that's immune to his shenanigans, and then so the rest of the party can deal with that, and then maybe like one big troll or something that he can feel powerful against.
Yep. Honestly, I think the best way around it is to just sort of address it at the beginning of the campaign. If your players are looking for something where they can just be the big man on campus and go slay a bunch of enemies, if they just want to like run through fields of mooks, then that's fine, but that's got to be something that's agreed upon at the beginning of the game.
Yep.
Where if we're looking for something that's going to be more equitable for everyone across the table, maybe it's something that we can address at character creation rather than halfway through the game, when people start getting annoyed that, hey, I don't get a turn in combat, what's up with this?
Yep. Yeah. And sometimes these things evolve, but sometimes they, like you said, there's a design philosophy in play, and prior versions of the game, maybe even 4th edition. I don't have a lot of experience with it, but you would plan out this kind of build so that at a certain level you would achieve a certain level of notoriety. Or
I've heard D&D 4th edition referred to as sort of the most video game-like of all the D&D editions. And to a certain extent, it does play out a bit like sort of your classic video game RPGs, like if you think Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic or Dragon Age, even like some of the Bethesda games like Fallout or Skyrim to a certain extent. It's very much a sort of tiered progression system where you acquire new skills that sort of outmode your other skills, and eventually, like, your character pathing grows with you. And I'm not entirely sure whether I agree with that design philosophy or not, but it was interesting for what it was.
Yeah, I'm running a fourth edition game on Gamers Plane now, and part of it was me and the guy that stood up for me at my wedding, my best man. We both purchased fourth edition when it came out, but never found anybody to play with it, play it with, because everybody we knew had, $600 worth of 3.5 books,
Oh, yep.
or maybe they started moving into Pathfinder. And so why would we play this game that widely is just World of Warcraft, the RPG, and give up all of the system mastery that we've acquired for this prior? Like, we're just telling stories. Why? So nobody ever really bought into it, but I've always been intrigued by it, and so hopefully,
Oh, yeah. It's widely different from either 3.5 or 5.0 from my experience, just in like how different it's set up. It's a very interesting system, and I think there's definitely like enough time to like talk about just fourth edition as an episode.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So when we're looking at combat and we're looking at the effectiveness of the players and the world around them, you had some ideas on how you might use mathematical tools in order to help work out what the the effectiveness of an encounter might be.
So some systems do give you a little bit of a clue into where monsters effectively fall. Like, for example, D&D, with the challenge rating, you have a general idea of how many players you need in order to address an enemy, how far leveled they need to be, what sort of party dynamics you need in order to take them on effectively. But for a lot of systems, I've found that that's not quite the case. So what I generally recommend is to figure out what your player's turn economy is. And what I mean by that is establish sort of how much damage, what kind of status ailments they can inflict over the course of one round of combat. So, for instance, if you have a fighter, a mage, and a barbarian, you're going to get perhaps a multi-attack out of your fighter. You might get a single targeted spell out of your mage and several more physical attacks out of your barbarian. So you're looking at maybe 4 to 5 attacks per round. And of course, with each of those attacks comes an expected value of damage. Like, for example, if you're rolling 2d6 for damage, then you can expect to get about 6 or 7 damage just based on a normal array of distribution. The same thing can be said if you're looking at something with a high chance to hit, but low damage. So if you have an attack that hits 75% of the time, that's expected to do 4 damage per hit, then you can expect 3 damage per round out of that. So at the end of your calculations, you can expect a certain amount of damage to come out of your team. Take that and multiply it by the number of rounds you want your enemy to survive, and that's roughly going to be the health points, at least, that you're looking at. And then if you need to change that to either make the fight longer or shorter, then sort of your options are going to be either reducing or increasing things like health points, armor class, saving throws, anything that will prolong or shorten their lifespan.
Yep. A friend of mine years ago had created a computer program, and this has been in the 90s. He was running an AD&D game, and his players had all memorized the monster manuals of the time, so he just wanted to create unique creatures. So he created this basically model of the party, and then would fight it against randomly generated monsters with random stats, and then figure out which one came out like you said, with a certain, maybe a 7-round life expectancy.
Mhm.
And so then one story came up as so he took this monster and he stuck it in a room and they open the door and they go in and they start fighting. And after like 20 rounds, they just walked out, closed the door, and left. The creatures basically did no damage whatsoever, but had like super high armor class and hit points. Because like the straw men, right?
Like a wet noodle fight.
Yeah. Eventually they just got bored. It's like, yeah, we're out of here. See ya.
Yep. That's the trade-off though, is if you're going to stat something with a particularly high AC, you're not going to expect a whole lot of attacks to land. So just as a recommendation, I tend to recommend that if you're going to adjust any of those sort of metrics on your monsters, start with hit points.
Yeah.
Because it always feels good from a player's perspective to land a hit. There's that little dopamine rush when you land a roll that's sufficient enough to land a hit. You get to describe it in character and all that. Um, so it's less about denying players that opportunity to do what they came to do, and more about just letting them do more of it.
Yeah. One of the pieces of advice I told my players one time was running a D&D campaign. I just said, like I don't have any notes, right? I don't have like a.
Mhm.
I'm just DMing D&D, and for me that's just there's no. I might have some books if I want to look something up, but I'm basically unscripted, and so they're fighting this boss or this this hard fight, and then eventually it's like how much damage have we done? I'm like, I don't know, I'm not keeping track. These guys are going to fight until I'm bored, and then you'll land a killing blow.
I have to admit, I do like that style of DMing, and I'm very guilty of changing numbers on the fly. Like anything short of like players figuring out what the exact AC of the monster is, I will change health points on the fly to my whim. I
Yeah.
don't know if that's something that a lot of DMs do, but I feel like the pacing of the session is worth more than whatever numerical accuracy I was trying to go for when I was coming up with this monster, I don't know, a couple hours before the game.
Yeah. Yeah, that's for sure. Like I'm mostly trolling my players when I said that.
Mostly.
Mostly, but yeah, the health pool is really just a guideline, right?
Yeah.
And so when when the fight has come to a foregone conclusion, then it's look for a big finish rather
Hmm.
than just for waiting for the dice to land a certain way.
Exactly. Because having to play that waiting game isn't fun.
Yeah.
Or at least it's not nearly as fun as finishing the fight in a cool way, moving on to the next cool thing you have planned. We're trying to have fun. We're not trying to be like super statistically accurate to whatever arbitrary rules were put together by the geniuses over at Wizards of the Coast or whatever.
Yeah.
Not to mention that a lot of people tend to throw in their own homebrew rules anyway. So once you start taking more homebrew rules into account, you can only go so far with what sort of pre-scripted stats are available for these monsters. Like for instance, I know there's a lot of D&D groups that ignore material things for spells. Like you don't need an Eye of Newt and 500 diamonds in order to cast a wish spell or something. Um, so again, as you move further away from those nitty gritty rules, the less you can rely on sort of the pre-scripted health for your monsters, and the more you're going to have to improvise a little bit.
Yep. Yeah, like one way to end combat quickly is when you if you're fudging the health pool is wait for a natural 20 or a critical hit. And then I think Matt Mercer does this on his show Critical Role
Mm-hmm.
is describe the kill, right? And just
Yeah,
leaves it up to the players to narrate how they so that critical hit may or may not have been doing enough damage, but if you're just fudging it a little bit anyway, then give them that glorious moment.
mm-hmm.
It's yeah.
Mm-hmm. At that point, we're swinging the just to get back into the balance of it. Um, until that monster is dead, there's sort of an unknown variable about where the balance lies. So to bring in that death of the monster, it shows that the fight was fair. There was a fighting chance for the players to actually beat this thing, to actually affect the outcome of the story.
Yeah. Yeah. And now that leads to another thing, though, is when you're talking about the script or the design of the game as intended, is that in games like D&D, they don't really expect you to fight one monster and then rest, recover all your spells and resources, and then fight one more monster and then completely do that. That there's this progression where maybe you fight 3 to 5 or face 3 to 5 encounters in a day, a gaming day, and then you rest and replenish your things. And so the difficulty of the game is based on that, and partially that you're not going to be at your best at the beginning of the fight. So by robbing the players of that resource drain, by ending the fight early, you are changing the outcome of the next fight as well. Right.
Exactly. And like you were saying, if you're going to go through and only affect or only have one fight per day, then it sort of cheapens the value of having spells or special moves when the players go to use them. If they're going to have them available for every single fight, then it just feels like it's normal. It feels like that's just what you do. There's no real strategic value in choosing one skill over another, holding off on a skill to use it for a later time. Those decisions are cheapened a bit.
Yeah.
So trying to apply a little bit of pressure and decision making to those fights is going to help establish a better sense of balance, where the players feel like there's an actual chance that they might make the wrong choice and have to live with those consequences.
Yeah. You know, with 5th edition D&D, I'm not sure if you've been playing that version as well. The short rest mechanic, I think, is insidiously brilliant about that, in that you can rest between encounters, but you're only spending an hour. Recover some hit points. Maybe the wizard gets a spell back, and then you can continue on. So if you've been brutalized in one fight or by a trap or something, you can recover some of your health. Then the players are more equipped to face more battles. And then what that leads to is that those once per long rest abilities or once per day abilities become much more something that you want to carefully manage rather than just blow it all on every fight. So the short rest, because in 3.5 in Pathfinder, we found if you had a tough encounter, the players were just like looking for any opportunity to rest. Like, you know what, we're done. We're just going to lock the door in the middle of this dungeon, and we're just going to stay here until we're fully healed, and then we'll go. I was like, oh.
Yeah.
So short rest really kind of takes away the need to do that.
Exactly. And that opens up opportunities on both ends of the play side, both for the DM and for the players. Because if the players are more willing to go and take on more encounters, then you can throw more things at them. And from the DM side, you can play a little bit more aggressively in a sense with the way that you stat your monsters. If the players have the opportunity to rest in between, you can be a little bit more aggressive. You can throw out some of the moves that you might be reluctant to use otherwise, because then it's just going to end the story early.
Yeah.
So I think it gives everyone a bit more leniency in terms of what they're willing to do, what they're willing to try. Even from a strategic side on the player side, if you know that you're going to have a chance to recover some health, you might take a suboptimal position in the fight and try to make something cool happen that you might otherwise think is just too risky. We're going to play it safe and stick to our knowns.
Yeah.
It opens up a lot of creativity and a lot of options, I think.
I think so too, yeah. The other part of these kinds of things are in game balance comes down to how much you want death and the possibility of a total party kill to show up on the page, right? Like
Yep.
how often do you want death on the line? Now it used to be prior, and especially in AD&D, that we would argue this all the time.
Hmm.
We'd be drinking at the bar after playing or something. Is like, death has got to be on the line, otherwise your choices don't matter, right? Unless there's the possibility of failure, why do anything? And games like Masks, I think, show that there's a different way to tell a story, right? Death doesn't have to be the consequence of failure.
Exactly. There are, I forget what series said it, but there are consequences that are far worse than death. There are not just like psychological ways to torment characters, but there's there's ways to show that what am I trying to get at? If you kill a character, then that's the end and the finality of it. There's no way for that character to grow. Their story is over. There's no real adversity to come that comes with death. So it can be compelling to show a character dying, but it's a limiting experience, I guess. Um, where it's much more difficult, I think, to show a character fail in a spectacular way, but then overcome that failure later on in the campaign, where perhaps that the consequences of that failure comes back and they have to live with the consequences of that failure and go forth and address it.
Yeah.
I also think that's a little bit more of a compelling story. But on the other hand, in situations where you do have a character death, that's also an opportunity for the rest of the group to grow as well. It's not just that one character at the table; everyone gets to react to it, and that's how you get a lot of those scenarios where the team sort of rallies around that character's death to grow closer together, to care more about each other, whatever it is. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to implement character death. It's just something that I think we need to be careful about implementing. It's
Yeah.
good when implemented right, but there's always something more to be said with a character that's alive than with one that's dead.
Yeah. I know that some of my players feel cheated, oddly, if you hold back.
Mm-hmm.
Like their death should occur. It's clear from the dice rolls and whatnot. You're like, well, no, something happens and you survive. They just feel like, well, that was a waste. Or
Mm-hmm.
and it's an odd reaction, because you'd think, well, they should be happy that they're not dead. But at the same token, then it cheapens the whole mortality battle that they've
Mm-hmm.
been fighting.
Exactly. It sort of pulls back the curtain to show that the game that you're running isn't exactly balanced in the first place.
Yeah.
If the characters are never going to die, then it's not balanced.
Yeah.
Like there's a certain limit that will not be crossed. And whether that's something that's if that's something that the players want or not is open to discussion.
Yeah.
But it definitely has to be a part of the conversation between the DM and the other players. Like,
Yeah.
is this something that should be a consideration or not?
Yeah. There used to be this joke of, and you start a new campaign and you've got a bunch of fresh players that haven't played with you a lot. Bring one of your friends in and just eviscerate their character on screen, right? Just like there's nothing left. There's no resurrection. They're just dead, right? And then send them home crying, right? And that's just a lesson to all the other players. So you could, at that point, kind of take death off the table, because you've already shown that it's on the table.
Mm-hmm.
So they're afraid.
Oh yeah. Or even doing that with like an NPC where this is something that can happen. Like have a character sheet for that NPC, play it the same way that all the rest of the players are doing, and then just murder the heck out of them, just to show that this is something that can happen. And that thought's going to linger. That's not going to go away anytime soon.
Yeah.
Like that makes a certain impression on the characters, where even if it isn't a reality, the perception that something like that is an option for their characters is going to affect the way that they make choices.
Yeah, there's a psychology at play, right? Like when you
Exactly.
kill off this NPC and you're like, oh, I can't believe that happened. My whole plot is really just I'm gonna have to think about how to go on, right?
Hmm.
You're just lying, right?
Oh
But
yeah, especially if it's like if it's a player favorite character, like everyone at the table loves that character, and you just rug pull that character out from underneath them. That's
yeah.
I don't know if that's a good psychological thing or a bad one, but you're going to get reactions and you're going to get players to make different decisions based on what they see.
And that's really what it comes down to with game balance, I think, is the psychology at play. And in that,
Mm-hmm.
when we're sitting down at the table or logging on to a play by post site, um, we're playing a meta game between our brain, our meat spaces, right?
Mm-hmm.
And each other through whatever interface, whether that's just a bowl covered with Cheetos or through a browser. And so the purpose of game balance is to address that psychology, right? Which is
Mm-hmm.
to make sure that the players know the rules and they know the rules are fair. The rules don't have to be fair in that they're guaranteed to win. Like you can have an over like Call of Cthulhu, you don't win, right?
Mm-hmm.
You just
Exactly.
you die or go insane, right? But the rules are clear, and there's that expectations there. So it's fair, right? What happens on that journey is what's important.
Exactly. It's that contract that you mentioned earlier about how a DM is supposed to operate with the characters and the characters are supposed to operate with the DM. There's an understanding there that if I act a certain way, then there will be certain repercussions for those actions. And as long as those repercussions are in line with what I expect, then that's a fair system in my eyes. I perceive it to be fair or balanced. And as soon as we start to deviate from those expectations, then it calls into question the real balance of the system. Even if it's something that's technically legal or technically plausible, but unlikely. And I think that gets back to sort of what you were talking about with your example about the tower that you cast the spell and collapse the tower with. It's something that's technically legal and technically allowed, but it's pretty far afield from what the DM would have expected. So
Yeah.
it's a bit of a reversal on what we might expect when we talk about balance, but there's still something to be said about addressing the expectations of what we think are possible within the system, within the game that we're using, within the rules that we've set for ourselves. It needs to be something that's plausible, something that seems like it's playing by the rules.
Yeah. Yeah. Player ingenuity is just a huge problem. I had a friend of mine who just the low level, he's like, could I get a wand of mount? I'm like, all right. So he used some gold and he bought it. What a mistake. The mount spell, which just summons a horse.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, brutal. So he would use this to like summon mounts on the edge of a cliff and then push them off and use them as like rocks to fall on people below him. Or if they're being chased in a dungeon, you summon a mount, break one of its legs. Now you've got this angry flailing horse that the people have to get past. Just on and on and on, right? Just this use for this giant living, flailing, screaming piece of meat.
Those solutions are so clever. I would never think of those solutions.
Yeah.
Those are, and they're all legal, right?
Yeah.
Those are all things you can do with.
Sorry about that. Zoom just crashed on me. So you were. It says it's still recording, so hopefully that all works. You were saying that the wand of mount idea seems like it was. It's all pretty legal.
Mm-hmm. But it seems like we're using mechanics for things that they were never intended to do before.
Yeah.
I think I'm getting a little bit of feedback through your end. I think I'm hearing myself through your camera.
Oh, interesting. Let me just pause.
Okay.
Recording in progress.
Yeah, so well, this is a great conversation. The details and mechanics of balance and why we might want to look for balance and what that really means. And I think it really comes down to, like you described at the beginning, of player agency, and that the players and the GM both want to be able to contribute meaningfully to the story. And the rules really allow us to give a sense of fairness, because without that fairness, then your choices don't matter as much. And so your your ability and willingness to participate in the ongoing narrative is going to be harmed.
Exactly. We come to play D&D to play a fun and fair game. So we want to set up some circumstances that everyone is going to find agreeable and is going to be able to contribute meaningfully to. So yeah, I think that's sort of the ideal, and that's what we shoot for. So anything that we can do to contribute more to that is only going to affect the game positively.
Yeah. And so the idea then isn't necessarily that the game has to be set up for a 50-50 chance of victory in every case, or that it's fair to all the parties involved, but that the players have an ability to see the world impacted by their choices, and that's what is ultimately rewarding.
Mm-hmm. Even in a bit of a cynical sense, it doesn't need to be 50-50. It just needs to look 50-50. Players need to perceive it as 50-50. And 50-50 isn't even necessarily what we're shooting for. It could be 75-25 or 90-10 for all that counts for. Like, if players sign up to run Tomb of Horrors, then there's going to be an expectation that they're probably not going to make it out alive. But you can still run a balanced Tomb of Horrors by playing to those expectations.
Yeah, and there are games like Maze Rats and I think Dungeon Crawl Classics where they're set up, bring 4 characters, because it's a meat funnel, right?
and those games are fun in their own right.
Yeah.
But it's a different expectation of what balance is supposed to look like in those games. So there's a bit of contextualness that goes into balance, where what is balanced in one game is not necessarily balanced in another game. So it's a process of reading the room, reading the system, and trying to synthesize something that looks like balance, where mechanically and numerically that's only half the equation. No pun intended.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for a great conversation.
Absolutely. This is great.
Yeah. So thanks everybody for watching. This is Gamers Explain, and I'm Qralloq, and I'd like to thank Khakiphil.
Thank you for having me on.
I'd like to thank Khakiphil for joining me today on Gamers Explain. I had a great conversation, and it was fairly animated, and I think you can both see that we had a lot to talk about. And particularly the issue of player agency is huge, right? You want the players to be engaged. They want to be able to feel like they've made a difference in the game and that they can affect the outcomes, and you're not just narrating a sequence of events for them. So hopefully you found this useful. I'm Qralloq, and this has been Gamers Explain.